Welcome everybody to the third webinar entitled Developing Action Plans, Public-Facing Buildings and Bigger Energy Users. Our team today is myself. I work as a sustainability consultant with Native Events. We have Katrina Fallon from the Green Arts Initiative, and joining us also from Native Events is Programme Manager Brecon Byron, who's helping us out with all the tech today. So I suppose a quick recap on where we are on our training webinar timeline. This morning, we're covering the webinar on action plans for, I suppose, bigger energy users and public-facing buildings. And then this afternoon, we'll be looking at a webinar on developing your action plan for office-based organizations, resource organizations, and production companies. But I suppose this morning, really, the webinar is aimed at organisations such as theatres, galleries and art centres, and organisations whose buildings might not be public facing but have more significant energy usage, and that can be studios, archives, printing or fabrication facilities, I suppose organisations that have these facilities. And then in the afternoon session, that will be more focused on office-based organisations. So that would be, I suppose, membership organisations, resource organisations, publishing companies, production companies, I suppose where your key activities are for others or they're carried out elsewhere. And then, of course, there will be some overlap between the morning session and the afternoon session. But we also appreciate that some organisations will attend the two. Maybe they are working with venues that are, I suppose, public facing and bigger energy users, and it makes sense for them to attend both. But you're very welcome to attend the afternoon session if you think that might benefit you also. And we'll pop a link to that in the chat also for you. So I hope that's clear in terms of our two different sessions and the reasons why we broke those up into two different sessions. But I suppose bringing us up to where we are today, and if you joined the first two sessions, I suppose at this stage you should really feel that you have an understanding of what an environmental policy should cover and to go about developing it. And really, I suppose your policy is your overarching approach. It will outline what kind of organisation you are, what your motivation is to create a policy, what your focus will be, and it also outlines what you believe your key impacts will be. We have covered how to identify and map your impacts and where you have most control and influence. And then I suppose last week we looked at why it's important to get people on board in developing your approach. We looked at how to identify and really, I suppose, be clear about who you need to engage with and who are your very important stakeholders within and outside of your organization. We looked at some examples. We took some real examples and I suppose some made up examples. And today we will also look at examples in relation to action planning, I suppose, just to make that real and relevant for you as we go along in the process. So really, I suppose the main aims of today's session will be for you to come away with a clear idea of what an action plan is and with a sense of what you should be focusing on in your action plan. And we want, I suppose, you to feel that after this session, that you're ready to start developing your action plan and you have the templates and the tools in order to do so. So I suppose in terms of what we're covering in today's webinar, as always, we'll do a quick recap of the previous sessions, and that'll be sessions 1 and 2. We will look at what should a climate and environmental action plan cover for organisations. And these will be organisations in larger buildings or with higher energy use, as we mentioned. We'll walk through how to go about developing your action plan. We'll go through different steps. We'll identify actions. We'll look at objectives. And I suppose we'll try and map those into various tools that we'll provide for you. We'll look at examples for different types of organisations and some activities. And then we'll finish up in summary with some do's and don'ts. And then, as always, allow time for some questions and answers. But I suppose to start off with, let's take a look at what an action plan should include. So some agreed objectives or your targets or your aims, a breakdown of the actions which will allow your organisation to reach those objectives, I suppose very important is identifying who is responsible for each action, putting a deadline or a timescale for the completion of each action, and then what you need to complete the action. And that can be a budget or whatever needs to be put in place in order for you to meet those actions. And then what are the outcomes? So I suppose the metrics of success. And so that's really, I suppose, a very broad outline of what an action plan should include. But I suppose before we start off, we would also like to understand who we have in the webinar today. And I suppose ask you to, we'll open up a Zoom poll shortly. And just to get a sense of who's in the room, are you an art centre, a theatre, a publishing company, resource organisation? And I suppose this is important because we want to identify, are there public facing buildings such as theatres, galleries and art centres in the room today? Maybe there's some buildings or organisations in buildings that are not public facing, but might have significant energy use as well. And it's really, I suppose, to understand what are the key activities that are being carried out within your organisation and how then they would, I suppose, impact how we will set your objectives and your targets and meeting those actions. So I'm seeing that there's results coming in there in terms of we have a lot of art centres. So there's 60% art centres. We have some visual art centres, galleries, museums, theatre, artist studios. So that's, I suppose, very much in terms of what we are looking at in terms of either public facing buildings or organisations that are using a lot of energy. So that's great. Yeah, we have, you're all in the right webinar anyway, which is great. So if we have a look then in terms of, again, I suppose recapping in terms of where we are in the process, looking at the benefits of having a climate action, environmental policy and action plan. And we have really focused up until now in terms of creating your policy, and creating your action policy and your action plan provides a consistency of approach across your organization. It provides the guidance and the momentum needed to achieve your aims and your objectives and your targets. But I suppose what's different and what we're looking at now is your action plan. And I suppose the difference there is that your action plan is like your live document. It can be updated regularly. It's kind of your go-to. And I suppose your action plan is something that I suppose you're assigning your tasks to your team members. There are deadlines. It's like a to-do list. And it's almost like that at every team meeting, you're referencing back to your action plan. Whereas your policy, your overarching document, that might be updated every year, but your action plan really is that live document that is getting you to where you want to be in terms of the objectives in your policy. And I suppose a good way of describing your action plan is that it's the template to ensure that all your team knows their involvement, knows their responsibilities, and it's very clear what actions have been assigned to them. So it's very important to understand the benefits of the policy and the action plan. And I suppose just to, lay it out very clearly in terms of really, I suppose, separating or not separating, but really identifying, what is your policy and what is your plan. So if we think of it like this, that your policy is your statement of top line environmental ambitions, your commitments, your goals, and your values and your principles. And that is going to be specific to your organization's size, scale, and the nature of your activities. And your activities, it's very important to identify those. Your policy, it makes clear who is accountable and who is responsible overall. And it provides a framework for environmental action and reporting. And then your plan is how you will achieve what you have set out in your policy. It will include your actions to reduce your impacts, to green your place, your practice, and your production. It will include the actions that inform, inspire, or support change. And it will be the actions around your environmental comms and your engagement. So I suppose you can see that progression in terms of you have your policy, and now we're talking about your plan, which is supporting that. And then I suppose hear from you in terms of your own action plan. We're going to launch another poll just to get a sense of, has anyone in the room created an action plan? Are you beginning to create an action plan? And I know that we have spoken to a lot of organizations during our roadshow who have completed a lot of actions, but they don't have an action plan. So I suppose it's important to say a lot of organizations have not needed an action plan in order to do so much. So I think just looking at the responses there, the majority of you are just starting to think about the action plan. So this is fantastic. From today, we're hoping that we have given you the tools to go away and start working on it. Some of you are already working on it, which is great. You have the beginnings of a good plan. And then, some of you have a list of actions and you have a plan, but it's not great. So I think and then another contribution there is that we don't have the action plan, but we've done a lot. So I think we're all, I suppose, in a similar place where we're either thinking about it or, we can certainly work on it after this session. So it's great to find out where organizations are. And of course, with these webinar situations, it's always good to get your feedback. So that's a great start in terms of where we are and who's in the room, and identifying this is your policy, this is your plan. And I suppose it just gives us a sense of where we are, and I suppose where we are in the process. And Katrina now is going to start looking at how to develop your action plan.
Thanks a million, Noreen. So that was great. It gives us, I suppose, the beginnings of and the context to creating your action plan. And I'm going to delve a little bit deeper into that and maybe look at what that might look like in practice in a real life situation. So, and I know there's a little bit of recap, which probably is a bit irritating for some of you, but just very briefly, if you think about the first webinar, one of the things because the whole process, it is a process. And if you like, these are steps along that journey, along that process, and hopefully together, there's a kind of coherent sense to it. There's a kind of scaffolding that you can work with. So in the first webinar, we itemized activities because we really believe that as arts organizations, that's what you know best. You know what you're doing, and you can map your impacts from those activities. And we went into a little bit of detail about how you might do that. And then the second webinar last week was about identifying your stakeholders and partners and working with them. And that's in the belief that really without that buy-in and that sort of wider engagement, it's more difficult to create a policy and a plan that's going to work for everybody. I would say that you could actually start with that particular step. So the whole mapping and collaborating with your partners, if you're really at the very beginning, there's no reason why you couldn't, especially if you're a small organization that has only maybe a couple of staff members, but maybe is engaging with a wider membership. So there is that potential. Again, things are a little bit slower, but it certainly has a very meaningful way of approaching the whole thing. But we'll go back to the initial approach, which is you've itemized your activities, you've mapped your impacts, you've identified who your partners are, and you're happy to collaborate with them. And now you're going to decide on your priorities. So that's something that really you're going to do individually as organizations. We can't do that for you. But what will help is if at this stage you have that strong grasp of your activities and your impacts, and if you're working with other people in your organization and outside of your organization, you're going to be in a much better position to decide what your priorities are. And then finally, using those priorities, you're going to set your goals and agree your actions. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And just a word of caution, this might seem like sort of a very obvious piece of cautionary advice, but avoid beginning at the end. So I have often seen organizations that might start with, one or two people or even one person will sit down and say, right, these are the objectives that I think we need to have for our overall policy, and these are the actions that we're going to carry out. But really, if you haven't grasped and understood what the impacts are, if you haven't gone through that initial process and you haven't engaged with others in your organization, you might find yourself setting objectives and actions that are not well informed or supported by others. And as I said, maybe in one of the earlier sessions, if you do that, it'll be quicker at the beginning. So you'll be able to sit down and maybe do that in a few hours, but you're inevitably going to meet roadblocks along the way. And the work that you do might not be as meaningful. So that would be my advice to you. Noreen mentioned that we've divided this action planning session into two. And so why have we done that? But basically, as you know, I suppose we have experienced also working in arts organizations and the kind of different issues and challenges that different kinds of arts organizations have. But we also heard a huge amount from all of you initially in the discovery phase, but also as we went around the country for those in-person sessions. And really what we found is that for sort of theatres, art centres, galleries and studios, energy usage is really a key impact. Whereas if you think about a resource organisation, energy usage is a much smaller impact. So, and it's not only a smaller impact, but if you are a larger building with larger energy usage, the chances are that you are more likely to have control over that energy use. So you're more likely to be in a position, for example, to change your electricity provider or decide what kind of a tariff that you're going to go with. If you're a smaller organisation, the chances are that energy, those decisions are being made by somebody else. You're maybe an office or a smaller space within a larger building. And then because you have the bill in those larger buildings, not always the case, but if you do have those bills, you then have information that you might not have in a resource organisation or a smaller organisation in a larger building. And if you have information, if you have bills, you can then look at the patterns of energy usage. You can find out a huge amount from looking at your bills that, again, that information is not available to you in a smaller organisation. And I would say then there is a kind of a crossover. There's a sort of strange interconnecting zone between both of those options. So you may have, for example, resource organisations with sizable enough buildings. So the Visual Artists Ireland, the Irish Film Institute, Irish Theatre Institute, all of those are such resource organisations for different parts of the sector, of the art sector. But they also have quite large buildings which are used by the public in various ways. Even some quite large venues will be in a position where they don't actually have access to that information. They don't pay their own electricity bills or their energy bills. So they're reliant on, they're maybe part of an even bigger complex, or they're relying on a local authority to pay their bills for them. And then obviously we're aware that, you know, if you're, for example, a theatre festival or a fringe festival, you're using those larger buildings to host your events, but you have no control or say over what happens. And that's really, in that instance, we would argue that the theatres or venues that you're using, they are the ones who have control and access to energy use, and they might share that with you. And you see that happening where sometimes production companies would ask venues for information on energy usage. So that's kind of the distinction between the two. So this afternoon session is much more appropriate for those organisations on the right-hand side with the smaller energy usage, and we're kind of focusing more on those larger energy users today. So we picked an example, and thank you very much to Axis in Ballymun, who've allowed us to use them as an example of a kind of an art centre. And part of the reason we wanted to use them is, you know, when you're looking at itemising your activities, Axis just have a phenomenal range of facilities and activities that happen there. So they have staged events in their auditorium, they have exhibitions in their gallery spaces, they have education and outreach in their workshop spaces, they run Staff a Cafe, they have a creche, rehearsal spaces, dance studio, recording space, and they have tenants. So it really is an extraordinary collection of activity and facilities in one building. And actually, I can't think of another example that's quite as broad, but at least some elements of this might resonate with you. And if we were going to map, and we're going to do this very briefly because obviously we've done this in the first session, but all of this feeds into what your actions might be. So I'm hoping this will make a kind of coherent thread for you. So if you look at the kind of impacts, if you looked at we've looked at all those activities. If we wanted to pick one activity and map it, let's just pick staging events in the auditorium. So anything in the auditorium is obviously going to use energy in terms of heating. The building has to be heated, both for performers backstage, but also the front of house part of the building, the auditorium itself. Lighting has been used in the lighting rig, electricity and energy has been used in building lighting, and there's all the other equipment in terms of the ticketing and other equipment backstage. And I've put then the cafe in red because if you're going to look at, obviously cafes open during an event in the auditorium, but I would suggest that you would analyse that separately. So you'd see it as a separate stream of activity and look at it in a whole, in the whole, in terms of what it does. Excuse me. But I'm just going to take this opportunity just to say a little bit about, we don't talk a huge amount about waste in this session. Waste generally, from the information that we have, if you are an art centre or a theatre, in terms of the overall emissions associated with waste, they would generally be very small unless you actually have a full-scale restaurant. They would generally be between 2 and 4%. So it's quite small in terms of the emissions, but obviously the ecological footprint of that is quite significant. But just a word on reusable cups, a bit of a bugbear of mine, but a recyclable cup. Just if you're using compostable or biodegradable bedware, just be very sure that is going into the proper receptacle. If somebody buys a cup of coffee in a biodegradable or compostable cup and leaves your building with it, unless they're putting that into a compostable bin somewhere outside, it's going to landfill or incineration. So just to bear that in mind, it's not always maybe the ecological solution we think it might be. But also in terms of staging events, other impacts might be around waste. That's in terms of audience and performers, sweet and snack packaging. There would be backstage, there would be wet wipes, makeup and so on. And there's obviously a lot of water from, excuse me, toilets and showers. But we're going to pick, let's say you've mapped that across we did this in the first session, how you might map those impacts across the various different areas. And having done that, so if you have done that, if you apply that approach to your organization and you have a sense of all those impacts, that puts you in a position now where you can decide what are the priorities that you will tackle in your action plan, because your objectives will obviously come from whatever is important to you. You decide what's important, you decide what the objectives are that are attached to that, and then you break it down into the individual actions. So I'm suggesting that Access might say that the priorities for them would be, because they've such a range of facilities, such a wide, a massive breadth of activity in the building, and a lot of that would be using energy. So inevitably for them, measuring, recording, understanding and reducing energy usage, both heating and electricity, that has to be a priority for an organization like that. And that would be the case for many of you if you're in large buildings. Energy is going to be a key, tackling energy is going to be a key priority. But because of the nature of Access and what they do, working with their local community and partners is just a really critical part. They're there for the community, they serve the community. So that has to be, those two, one is a very pragmatic priority, one is something much more sort of holistic and much more about the essence of what they do. But those two priorities can be included in and reflected in how they draw up their action plan. So and those are the priorities they're going to Access. I suggest this is totally from the outside looking in at Access. At this point, they would set the goals and agree action. So given that energy, we've agreed that energy is a priority for them, tackling their energy. So here are 2 goals, objectives, whatever you want to call them. So these might be, if you're going to put, you probably put no more than 4 or 5 goals into your action plan. Your action plan is a short-term document lasting for a year, possibly even less. So you don't want more than 4 or 5 goals to deal with. So if you have, I would suggest they might have 2 goals connected with energy. One is understanding their energy usage. So the goal is to measure our building energy usage, both heating and electricity, for 2025 and set a target for reduction by the end of 2026. For those of you who are starting out, you probably or may not have a full understanding of your energy usage, and for various reasons you may not have access to it. But even if you do have your bills, you may not be at the point where you really understand that energy usage. So that's why I would suggest that you would start from the beginning in getting that baseline understanding. But for others amongst you, you've already done this. You understand your building energy usage. You may even have carried out energy audits. So your goals will reflect where you are in that journey. You're going to be further along. You will have maybe set a target, or you will be looking at particular actions that will help to make your building more energy efficient. The second goal we're suggesting is behavioral change, working with the staff team and others in the building to change behavior around energy usage. So those are the goals. And because in themselves, they can be still maybe a tiny bit abstract, less abstract maybe than the overarching policy aim, but still abstract enough in the sense that we need to break it down into chunks to make sure that actually happens. So many of you will be familiar with this idea of objectives being SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound, and inclusive and equitable is a more recent addition. So they really have to fulfill all those criteria in order for it to make it viable for you to achieve them. So let's look at that initial goal we suggested, the understanding energy usage, and try and break that down into a series of actions. So, for example, an initial action might be to set up a spreadsheet with shared access for the staff team with tabs for heating and electricity usage by month. Another action would be somebody has to input the monthly usage from energy bills. You want to identify somebody who's going to do that. A good person might be whoever is the finance officer, because they're already opening electricity bills or receiving them by email or whatever. So they would be putting that information into a financial spreadsheet somewhere. Maybe they could put in the kilowatt hours into your energy spreadsheet. Take meter readings and submit these to our energy providers on the first of every month. If you don't have accurate, if there isn't a regular meter reading, if your meter is read once a quarter, your bills then are not going to reflect energy usage back to you correctly. You'll only have a vague sense of energy usage. So it's really important to make sure that you do submit those. Most buildings don't have smart meters yet. That's yet to come in. We have them in our houses. And once we have those for buildings, we'll understand a lot more. And finally, apply for an energy audit voucher from the SAAI and appoint an energy engineer to carry out the energy audit. So again, that's something that quite a few people have already done, quite a few organisations have done. But if you haven't, and you are a large building, and if you spend more than €10,000 a year on electricity, for example, or on energy, you're entitled to apply for an energy audit voucher. So I would just suggest those are the kinds of actions that Access might include in their action plan. So hopefully you've got the objective, you break the objective down into the actions, and just don't forget to agree who is going to carry out each action and a deadline for completion of that action. Because if you don't know who's going to do it, it won't get done. And if you don't have a deadline, it's one of these things that's going to linger. So that's a key part of it. And Noreen is going to show you a template that you can use to do that. And finally, just maybe if you're an organization that has no information on energy usage, maybe your bills are being paid elsewhere, maybe by a local authority, for example, can you get access to those? Sometimes that is possible. I've worked with organizations that didn't have the electricity bills themselves, but were able to get them from the local authority. If you have a landlord, maybe you could request information on energy usage from the landlord. They may have some kind of a breakdown. Could you connect with another arts venue of a similar size and similar activity that does have good information on their usage? And maybe something like sub-metering or even energy monitoring equipment might be an option. And we will go into energy in a lot more detail on the session that we're doing on the 9th of July. So that might be something of interest to some of you here. The second objective or goal we set was, behaviour change, working with the staff team and others in the building to change behaviour around energy usage. So again, if you're going to break that down into a series of actions, I would suggest they could look like this. So arrange energy saving session with the staff team, share information on energy usage and how this will be measured. So if you have that information already, can you share that with a wider staff team? People are really motivated by seeing those kind of details and seeing how that can be reduced. Do a walkthrough of the building, a very useful way of, start at one point from when the building's opened up, walk all the way through and see if there are any anomalies, like somebody comes in and turns all the lights on in a building when the building actually doesn't open to the public until an hour or two later. Agree a switch off campaign with the staff team and place switch off signage by light and switches and in dressing rooms for those that are building users, other people that are coming in to use your building. And the SEAI runs an energy academy. So there's an online course that you can do. I think it's about 2 hours. You can take it at your leisure. So it's an idea would be to encourage all staff to undertake that online training with the SEAI. All right, apologies. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I know now that I've kind of given you that sort of example, Noreen is going to talk to you in a little bit more detail about the kind of templates. So that's maybe kind of I've used Access, thank you for permission to use them, as an example of what you might do if you're creating your action plan. And Noreen is going to show you some templates that might help you to do that.
I just needed to unmute myself. So can you see my screen, Katrina? Is that?
I can indeed. Yeah, that's great, Noreen.
So I suppose what I'm going to do now is take what Katrina has said and put this into templates. So we'll give you, I suppose, a number of examples in terms of how to, I suppose, frame what Katrina has told us in these templates. And I suppose I'm going to give you as well some examples of organizations in terms of their actions and what was impactful for them. So I just wanted to show you this table in terms of how you can use the SMART approach. In terms of some examples, I'll just walk through a number of organizations we contacted. We just wanted to ask a few organizations what were the most impactful and meaningful actions that they had taken. We spoke to West Cork Music. They already have an action plan in place, but they told us that the most meaningful action had been to firm up their residency policy for artists, and also asking artists directly to try and make more use of slow travel. So they had various, I suppose, actions around that. And it was quite impactful in terms of, I suppose, their reductions in energy. In 2019, transport accounted for 70% of their emissions, and in 2022, they had reduced that down to 51%. So for them, those actions had been very impactful. Another organisation we spoke to was Cushcame Dance Theatre, and they very kindly shared their environmental action plan with us. They've sent us a link that we can share with you in terms of viewing that action plan. But I suppose what we looked at was they had objectives set out as part of the action plan. The objectives are listed here in terms of reducing the environmental impact of their activities, minimizing waste, mainstreaming environmental care in all of their activities, and then I suppose to be valued and independently recognised as an innovator in the evolution of sustainable working practices. And when you look at these objectives in their plan and you look at how the actions are supporting those objectives, we just took two as an example, but you can view all of their objectives and actions. So I suppose just putting that in context, we've just selected two. But here you see one of the objectives was to continue to replace inefficient fixtures and fittings and updated processes to achieve carbon neutrality. And their actions to do that were to replace their wall heaters, redesign and rebuild their website, conduct an energy audit, and develop a plan to implement its recommendations. And then another objective, I suppose around that behavioural change, was to implement and highlight micro actions that mitigate climate change in everyday life. And then you can see some of the actions that were supporting that objective. There was a wide range of actions. They varied from encouraging dry waste recycling, avoiding single-use items, promoting the bike to work scheme, using natural cleaning products, and so on. And I suppose you see there, the top line is the energy piece that Katrina was speaking about. I suppose how that is such a high impact for organizations. But then interestingly, the second objective and action was around that behavioral piece. So it's just interesting to see how organizations are putting forward their action plan. What we don't have is who was responsible for the actions and the deadlines and any related budget, because of course that would be your internal information. So organizations would of course not normally publicize that. Another example that Katrina will go through is the Theatre Royal in Waterford.
Yeah, so many of you are familiar with the Theatre Royal in Waterford, and they have done a lot of really interesting work around greening their venue. And we did ask them also, what was the most impactful and meaningful action they have taken. And interestingly, they said the development of partnerships with the local authority was a really key one for them. And I suppose they're very fortunate in that Waterford is a very sort of forward-thinking local authority and very supportive of what they're trying to do. So they're really in the throes of hoping to get some large physical work done in collaboration with the local authority that would make a big difference to their energy efficiency. That was one, again, that very pragmatic, looking at energy usage. It's a big building. But secondly, they also created this, you can just, if you can probably can't see, there's a beautiful biodiversity garden just in front of the building that they created as part of their overall approach. And that has interestingly fed into a lot of kind of creative work. They have an artist in residence who focuses very much on biodiversity and that link with that beautiful garden. And they've just finishing up a lovely series of events for young people and for children where the wildflowers grow. So what that whole biodiversity garden, I suppose it's like a kind of a testament or a statement when people enter the building that they can see how significant, by looking at the biodiversity garden, everything about it, it signals that intention that they have to be as green as possible. I also love their little logo. So the Theatre Royal Waterford logo, they've adapted that slightly for anything that's in connection with the greening activities. And it's green and it has butterflies around us. So it just, again, it signals their commitment to being greener and to being more environmentally sustainable. And the second example, another theatre in Dún Laoghaire in Dublin, and this is the Pavilion Theatre in Dún Laoghaire. And again, we asked Niall O'Connell, who's been kind of leading the charge there on environmental matters, what he thought was the most impactful and meaningful actions they have taken. And interestingly, he said, measuring and monitoring our energy usage from their bills. They took part in the Greening Venues pilot some years ago, and they've been measuring their energy usage ever since. And this has framed everything in fact and has allowed us to argue for more support and funding to improve our environmental sustainability. So it allowed what he felt was that, you know, measuring their energy usage and then using that information to reduce their energy usage, along with a very good technical manager there and a very supportive director and staff team. So they've managed to reduce it, and then they can go to the board and they can even go to the local authority there who fund them in part and say, this is what we've done. What more can we do? If you can support us, we can do more. So they've used that information as well as achieving a practical result. They're also using that to leverage better results again. So I think that's another very good example of what can be done.
Thanks, Katrina. So now we'd like to hear from you, I suppose, in terms of if you have already taken any actions, you know, maybe the most meaningful or the most impactful, or actions that you're very proud of. I suppose just to get a sense of the actions that organizations are taking, and maybe to give you some examples during the roadshows that we were doing around the country. This was a question that we also asked attendees, and maybe some of you actually were in attendance at some of those events. But at every session, we would ask attendees, you know, I suppose the action that they had taken to reduce their environmental impacts. And then these are ranked in terms of order of, I suppose, popularity, or what was the most actions that organizations had taken. So you can see there, I suppose, the most common or the most frequent actions that came up was to improve waste segregation, and then down to reducing printing and paper, and so on. So I suppose just to get a sense of actions that you have taken, if you wanted to pop any of those into the chat, and you know, these can be, I suppose, the most impactful, the most meaningful, or the actions that you're most proud of. And I suppose if any of you do have an action plan that you've created, if you do want to share that with us as well, that would be great. But it's just to get a sense of, you know, what actions have you taken in terms of your activities and your organizations, and maybe, you know, we'll see that it is very similar to what we heard in the roadshows as well. I see there is something coming in the chat there. If there's anything there, Katrina and Brecken, I might get you to look at the chat and what's coming in.
Katrina, you're on mute.
Apologies, everybody. We've been awarded, Nikki French Davis says, we've been awarded funding under local climate action plan for reducing car parking space to replace with biodiversity, energy saving infrastructure, and supporting sustainable travel, still at planning stages. That's great. And that's something that I actually haven't heard too often. And I know that, you know, there's a lot of pressure on, for example, organisations in the city centre, particularly in Dublin, to do something similar. I found working through the smarter travel mark process has been really helpful, but that's a very good tip. Thank you very much, Nikki. So the smarter travel mark process. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid to look at Zoom in case I crash my screen or something.
Yes.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Like, we had great feedback when we were doing the roadshow, and I suppose it's in person. It's so much easier to engage with people and get the feedback. But it was really interesting in terms of the actions that people were taking, and some very unique as well. So we were learning from that too. We went around. Okay. Very good. Okay, so I suppose I will start looking at some templates, and of course everything we look at today will be made available as part of the recordings and the slides. So I suppose what we looked at last week was developing your policy, and we provided a template that will be uploaded shortly in terms of using to develop your policy. And this is, I suppose, accompanying that policy template. This is the action plan template that we wanted to share with you. And really, as Katrina was saying earlier, you know, it really is those 4 or 5 key objectives or targets or aims that you want to be looking at. Because really, I suppose your action plan is for 1 year or less, and you really want clearly defined objectives. And I suppose with corresponding timeframes and I suppose responsibilities. So this is just an example of a template, but what we decided to do was to take the two, I suppose, actions that Katrina spoke about earlier and to map those out into a table. So Katrina spoke about the two actions in terms of understanding your energy usage and changing behaviours, and she went through the various aims. So I won't repeat those, of course, but I wanted to show you how we had put these into a table. So I suppose this is one option in terms of outlining your action plan, looking at your objectives or your targets or your aims. I suppose mapping actions to those, and then looking and identifying who would be responsible for each action, deciding on what deadlines to put against those actions. Is there a budget, and what are the outcomes? So this is just one example. Of course, there are many, and you might already have a template that you are used to and familiar with that you want to continue using. But just in terms of our own activities on how we did this in taking those examples, we looked at the objectives in terms of understanding your energy use. We looked at the different actions that Katrina had outlined. The responsibilities, we just mentioned the facilities or the account manager, but, for each organization that could be different. And then looking at, I suppose, particular deadlines. I suppose in terms of capturing the energy usage monthly, that would of course be immediate, or it could be immediate and that would be ongoing. But then, applying for your energy audit and engaging with SEAI, you could have, I suppose, deadlines against that as well. And then the possible budget, which would be the grant, and then the outcomes, I suppose. So it's really taking your objectives and just having that formula almost, or that format, in terms of how you work through the actions and how you identify who's responsible and the deadlines and the budget and the outcomes. And as I said at the very start, this is such a live document. This is meant to be tweaked. It's meant to be, I suppose, looked at every team meeting, and it's not a document that is that just sits there for the 12 months. It is a live document. Looking at the second objective that Katrina mentioned in terms of that behavioural change, we plotted out the actions. I suppose the responsibilities there, we would hope that all staff would be responsible and engaged and would be sharing that action. And then in terms of the deadlines, we felt that was also immediate, but to put that into, if you have a team meeting, have that as a recurring agenda so that we're reminding everyone to do this. But again, I suppose it will be different for all organizations. All organizations have different activities, but I suppose it's just a suggested process that you can go through in terms of identifying those actions to meet your objectives. This is another example of a template, and we will, of course, upload all of these, but it's just a different approach that an organization can take in terms of, I suppose, trying to identify actions and map responsibilities against those and what you need in order to achieve those actions. So there's just different ways of doing this, and we just wanted to show you some of those examples.
It might be worth saying, maybe just very briefly, Noreen, apologies for interrupting you, that obviously so many people have done a huge amount of good work, and I'm not going to name them, but I can think of a lot of organizations that we know that have carried out great sort of environmental actions, but have never created a policy or action plan. So of course, it's absolutely possible to do great work without that formal structure. But what we're really saying to you is that that structure creates a kind of a consistency. It means that if staff changes, instead of having one sort of passionate climate ambassador in your team, if that person moves on, that the momentum to keep that work going is there and the commitment is there. So it does formalize it, and it means that there's kind of hopefully consistent progress over time. So that's the merit to having a policy and an action plan. Doesn't mean that you won't do anything good without it, but hopefully it will make the approach overall more consistent.
Yeah, that's correct. And I suppose as well, what we did hear from doing the roadshows, or that so many organizations were doing so much that it was already there. And it was just, I suppose, to put all of that in the action plan. So I suppose that's important for us to acknowledge today as well, and to provide those templates to organizations so that, you know, it's an easy process in terms of creating the action plan. So that is, yeah, it's very true. And of course, so many organizations have done so much. So hopefully it will not be a difficult process for organizations to complete this. So I suppose in terms of summarizing, just in terms of the action plan do's and don'ts, what we feel is very important is that you're linking your goals to your policy, your commitments, your priorities. And as we said, that policy is the overarching document, and the action plan is supporting that in terms of the objectives. Really aim to update your action plan annually or more frequently. You know, it should be that live document, it's your to-do list. You know, we feel that it can be updated. And Katrina, as you were just saying, if I suppose if someone leaves the organization, that you do want to update that to reflect all the changes the organization is going through. Ensure that actions and outcomes are agreed with your wider team. So this is everyone's document, you know, like this is everyone's feeding into this. They have their responsibilities, and you know it should be discussed frequently to ensure that everyone is in agreement. And in terms of those expectations on what actions are set as well against different people. So definitely make it clear who is responsible for what, so that it's so this is what I have to do. It's clear, it's in the action plan, and it's easy then to implement. And then I suppose, as we've been saying throughout the webinar, you know, commit to no more than 6 actions in a given year. You know, you really, I suppose it's to do a few, but to do them properly would be very important.
And I think that's actually an error on my part. No, that should be 6 objectives. So the actions might be more than 6. Apologies, yes, everyone. So we'll correct that. So commit to no more than 6 objectives, and then you break those objectives down into actions. So we'll amend that. Apologies.
Yeah, so you could have several actions to an objective as well, depending on the objective. So some of the don'ts then, we wanted to, I suppose, sound a caution to, I suppose, having net zero as a goal. You know, we do hear about that a lot, but we just wanted to make sure that, you know, that we all really understand what net zero is, and that there is some hope of achieving it. You know, I suppose it's you want to be ambitious, but you want to be realistic as well, of course. So don't be vague. Like the action plans, they just really need to be clear. I suppose concise. It's not using language that people don't understand. Your action plan really is that, you know, I suppose to-do list. It should be practical. It should speak to everyone in the organization. So I suppose this is your chance to have a very, I suppose, a distinct and very concise list of actions. Don't set an action for an impact that you don't yet understand. That's really important, because if you don't understand it, then the chances of meeting the action are reduced. So I suppose in terms of like that broad objective of reducing your energy use by 50%, you know, how would you achieve that if you haven't yet measured your energy usage, or if you're not clear on those actions as to how you would reduce that energy? And then don't focus exclusively on waste. As we've been saying, emissions from energy are almost certainly more significant. So some do's and don'ts, there's a lot more there, depending on your organization and your activities, but I suppose just to provide that, I suppose, summary. And then we'll have a quick look at what's next in terms of the training webinars. Of course, we do have that session this afternoon that we spoke about. And then next week, we'll be measuring impacts the same time. And then the following week in July, we'll move on to nature and biodiversity, buildings and energy, materials and procurement. And then, as we've been letting you know, in September, October, we'll be focusing on festivals, training webinars, and that would be, I suppose, greenfield festivals. So just, I suppose, to recap on what's coming up. So Katrina, I don't know if you want to add anything there, or if there's...
Yeah, maybe just on the final, the kind of don'ts of the action plan. I think it's important. Often in action plans, you'll see when we talk about people being a little bit vague, you might see we will aspire to, or we will we hope to, or we will endeavor to. So, you know, in a sense, if you have an action plan where you can actually kind of avoid doing any of the actions because it you know, your action plan kind of gives you get out of jail free card, you might question the merits of that. So, you know, if you can't commit to something, if you think you're not going to be able to do it fully, maybe you can do a sort of 50% reduction in something. if you can't eliminate a particular activity or eliminate a particular kind of waste, can you reduce it? So try not to be, I think I put in that, don't equivocate, don't kind of give yourself too many clauses to get you out of really taking action, because it can become a little bit meaningless. And there are a lot of examples of policies and action plans that do exactly that. And I would say that, you know, we are in that climate emergency, and we need to be very committed and specific as to what we're actually going to do. Yeah, thanks, Nori.
Yeah, no, very important. And this is your chance I suppose, to be very clear on the actions, and for the people involved as well. You know, they do want those clear actions as well, and how they're going to do it. So it benefits everybody.